What is a share rate and why does it matter? Why do we care about shares? In HEX, at least. The reason we care is because we're here to make money. That's what we want. We want the most money we can get. That's why we're going to learn about shares. If there's only one thing that you're going to learn from this video and you don't want to watch the whole thing, I'll tell you what you already know. Staking longer is better. But staking longer trumps staking bigger. If you had to choose one thing, one attribute about your stake, if you could either make it really big or if you could either make it really long, you're probably going to end up doing better with it longer. Now, within reason, you know, if you're going to stake 1,000 shares versus 10 million, you know, it's obvious. But when you stake longer, you get something called shares, and you're going to have more of them when everybody else doesn't have any. That's why staking longer is so important. The only reason that shares exist is to keep people from gaming the system in a way such that short stakes compounded outperform long stakes. So the problem that the HEX development team was trying to solve when they came up with the share idea, they wanted to solve the problem of people just doing 2-week stakes, compounding their interest, rolling it all back into another stake, rolling it all back into another stake, and doing that enough such that you could outperform a long-term stake. That's why shares exist, and that's, from what I understand, that's the only reason shares exist, is to defeat that problem, because it's a big problem. By the way, we're all still learning how this stuff works, so if you find anything in this video that doesn't make sense, or if you find anything that you think might be wrong, feel free to comment in the comments, because we're all learning. So I made a video about how the current inflation rate was not actually 3.69%, but it was actually 15%. That video was kind of right in some ways, and in some ways it's kind of wrong. There's some oddities in there. So you're not actually going to make 15% if you stake your coins for 2 weeks. And I'll tell you why. There is what I'm going to refer to as an equilibrium point in HEX. So imagine just a number line. At the beginning, you've got a 1-day stake, and at the end, you have a 555-day stake. There's an equilibrium point within there somewhere in which you will make, because there are only 24% of people staked. There is a point, and we did the conversion in the other video. You can go back to that one. There is a point, there's an equilibrium within there where you will make 15% interest over the whole APR, at least. Not over the whole APR, over the entire, per year. If you stake below that equilibrium point, so right now the equilibrium point, I believe, is around 4+ years, maybe 4.5 years. That is the average stake length. So if you stake for less than the average stake length, you're going to get less amount of APR. You're going to get less than the average APR. And this is where shares come in. So whenever you stake your HEX, you have a claim on a certain number of shares per day. And as days go by, the number of shares that people get per their HEX goes down. So if this year you lock in a stake for 10 years, and let's say you got 97 million shares per hex, you're going to have in year 9 that 97 million shares per hex is going to be massive. It's going to be really big. So this is how you can imagine it. You got to imagine it like a pie, right? So today, if you were to set up a 10-year stake, today, as far as percentage of total shares in circulation, and this isn't drawn to scale, but you have this little piece of the pie. So today, your shares represent a very small amount of the pie because there's people that came in before you and staked before you, and they ended up getting a lot more shares than you. Now, over time, as the years go by, the amount of shares that's going to be available to people per set hex amount is going to go down a good bit. And the people that you're competing with right now that already have shares, their shares are either their shares are either going to be expired or claimed or penalized by early withdrawal. So because the average stake length right now is 4 years, by the time you get to years 8, 9, 10, most of the people that you're competing with today will already be gone. Their stakes will be done. And you will be competing with people that started their stakes with much less favorable share rates. So in years 8, 9, where you had a certain piece of the pie back then, your share of the pie is going to actually grow over time. So the first one, we're just going to say day 1. I'm just using the second one as an example because I don't know the exact everything's. So the first one, we'll just say that's day 1 of a 10-year stake. And then the second one, we'll say that's year 8 of a 10-year stake. Over time, your share of the pie is going to grow. And it's going to grow a lot. It's going to grow a lot. And I'm going to quote to you. So here's the thing. If you watch the Discourse Syndicate from the other day, you'll see where Kyle did some simulations. They did simulations on staking. Well, I read the reports that they generated from that simulation. And the simulation shows, and this is the numbers are outlandish. And again, the stuff that I'm going to quote, I'm quoting Kyle. I'm quoting a HEX dev. So if you don't agree with me, I'm just quoting the dev, bro. This isn't stuff I made up. But I'm going to draw a little number line here, like what I did earlier. And I'm going to draw, this is just going to model a 10-year stake. And the average is going to be 4.5 years. So it's just a number line right there. So everything below the average, you're going to have a smaller amount of shares relative to the entire ecosystem. Your percent of the entire ecosystem is going to be less than everybody else. So you're going to be making less than 15% APR per year. However, once you go above the average, your percent ownership of the entire share pool per day is going to be much greater because everybody else is going to be handicapped. Everybody else that's entering stakes in your year 8 and your year 9, they're going to be totally handicapped, and they're going to get really they're going to be very disadvantaged. I'm hesitant to say lower share rate versus higher share rate because there's an inverse thing in there, and I don't want to be confusing, so I'm not using that terminology. But anyway, so if you go above the average, if you go above say 4.5 years, you're going to be getting greater than 15% inflation. Your share of the total inflation being generated goes higher than normal. So your peers, some of your peers with the 4.5-year stakes, they're going to be sitting there still collecting their 15% or whatever. You're going to be collecting more. And I'm going to quote the simulation that I can't remember if it was Kyle or the dev above him that wrote the report. But they said 10-year stakers saw 80x principal. Not 8x, not 3x like the big payday or 1.5x. The ownership of the pool is so heavily skewed towards long-term stakers that 10-year stakers saw an 80x profit on their initial investment. I've never heard anybody quote that simulation. I read that and I was like, what are you talking about? 8. I thought it would be maybe 15% per year compounded. You know, that's pretty cool. It's not 80x. 15% compounded for 10 years is not 80x. I promise you that. This is probably going to be part one of a number of parts on shares. Just because they're a lot more important than I ever understood. I'm still learning about HEX. Y'all are still learning about HEX. Shares are a lot more important than I think anybody, well, not anybody, but than a lot of people have been really thinking about. And you might have seen me on Twitter. I was harping on how many total shares are there in the ecosystem. Because if you know how many shares there are in the ecosystem, you can actually calculate something like what your return is going to be. So you know, I'm going to use facetious examples. If there's a total 100 shares in the entire ecosystem, total, and you have one share of the ecosystem, that means that you're going to collect a percentage of that entire ecosystem payout, which is ultimately, with 24% of people staking, that's 15% inflation. But 15% inflation of such a massive ecosystem, I'm not going to be explaining this well. 15% inflation of such a massive ecosystem, if you own 1% of that, it's a big deal, and it can, yeah, that doesn't make any sense. I'm going to have to come back and do another video because I'm going to have to study this for several more days to really, because if you don't truly, intrinsically, deep down understand something, you're not going to explain it very well. And I'm still learning how the shares work, so I'm not going to be able to explain it super well. So this is just going to be the first video of multiple parts. Just kind of disregard the end of what I just said there.